Welcome to the Student Faculty Seminar of the Presidential Lecture Series and the Philosophy Forum. This afternoon, our speaker is Josef Joffe. He is a noted scholar and journalist. He has a PhD in government from Harvard. He has published several books. He has widely and prominently published in various journals and periodicals. Currently, he's adjunct professor of political science at Stanford and fellow of the Hoover Institution at Stanford. As a journalist, he was editorial page editor of the Süddeutsche Zeitung from 1985 till 2000, and he then assumed his position as publisher and editor of Die Zeit, a widely read and respected German weekly. You will get a full account of his accomplishments and his background this evening when at 8 o'clock in the University Theater he will talk about Europe in the 21st century, too big to be left alone, too weak to go it alone. This afternoon his topic is Iraq. This is a question. Iraq, America's most foolish war. Most foolish war. And please, question mark. So please join me in welcoming Josef Joffe.
Thank you very much for this generous introduction. Can you hear me? Yes, it's on. I have tons of equipment here. I can't move. So I just have to go sit here. Don't make me jump up and try to strangle somebody in the audience. So you have to be very nice and polite to me. Let's start with the most foolish war question mark. Generally, we think that the most foolish war in American history was one that probably everybody in this room has never heard of, which was the War of 1812. How many have heard of the War of 1812? Wow, you're much better than my students at Stanford. Congratulations. And the reason why it was called the most foolish war is that here was this small country, just what teenager, as it were, if you consider that it was founded in 1776, with a few creaking vessels taking on the largest, most powerful navy in the world, the Brits, who had been fighting their war against Napoleon and who did not like the idea that other nations were trading with Napoleon, and who did all kinds of nasty things to American ships and especially American sailors whom they impressed. Anyway, so this tiny little country takes on the most powerful nation on earth, and that was pretty foolish. But in the end, it turned out to be only half foolish, because on the one hand, the Brits did burn down much of Washington, which had a good side because it was really a very rinky-dink capital. And afterwards, they brought in a French architect by the name of Pierre L'Enfant, who then laid out Washington as we know it today. Almost has a kind of air, almost looks a bit like Paris, with its avenues crisscrossing the city. And in the very end, the two kind of fought to a draw in the Battle of New Orleans, so it was only half foolish. We'll get to Iraq and why I think it is foolish, but let me just frame the issue a bit historically or conceptually, if you wish, before we get to the war itself. I'd like to start with a moment in American foreign policy, which is even more forgotten than the War of 1812, and that's Christmas Day of 1991. Does anybody know what happened on Christmas Day 1991? That was one of the most momentous occasions in the history of the state system. This is when, for the last time, the red hammer and sickle flag came down over the Kremlin, and up went the blue, red, and white flag of Russia. So that was a moment when one of the largest empire in history, empire encompassing 11 time zones, committed suicide, if you wish. It dissolved itself. The Soviet Union was no more. Left over was a bunch of successor states, plus it's the core state of the Soviet Union, Russia. That happened at precisely 7:32 p.m. on Christmas Day, on the 25th of December. And though it was a defining moment, the historical significance of that was hardly understood. And we'll get to where it impinges in a very fundamental way on American foreign policy. But though it was hardly noticed, the self-dissolution of the suicide of the Soviet Union did mark one of the rarest moments in the history of the state system, namely the transformation of the very stage on which world politics unfolds. And the consequences, especially for American foreign policy, that's a key part of my argument, have been momentous, and they will reverberate for much of the rest of the 21st century. Why was it such a why was it an enormous watershed? And why didn't we notice? Well, no, we didn't notice because normally empires don't die in bed. Normally empires die in war. The Roman Empire took about 300 years, but it was brought down by its many enemies. World War I was the biggest empire slayer of them all. It led to the demise of the Habsburg Empire, the German Empire, the Tsarist Empire, and the Turkish, the Ottoman Empire. So normally empires don't die in bed, but this one did. And that's why we didn't notice. But nonetheless, here are the consequences. What happened and what went before? Well, before, there were these two giants bestriding the stage, known also as bipolarity. There are these two giants constraining each other, devaluing each other's unprecedented power, and on top, of course, nuclear weapons, condemned the two of them to use a much well-worn metaphor of the Cold War, to life of the two scorpions in a bottle. They hated each other. They were loaded full of deadly poison, but they had to live with each other because each one knew that whoever shoots first dies second. Now suddenly the red scorpion had died, committed suicide, and the bottle had burst. And now there was only one, the red, white, and blue scorpion, left, and he was suddenly free to roam the world. Suddenly this giant, this American giant, was untied, Gulliver. The ropes had fallen off. And hence, I think, that's my first argument, a fundamental change in behavior on the part of the red, white, and blue scorpion. Remember what the Cold War was all about. It was an enormously ritualized conflict that should have been the most deadly conflict in world history, but wasn't, because going first, trying to kill the enemy, wasn't going to get you anywhere. You would die as second. And so this for 40 years we played this very ritualized ballet of of thrust, counter-thrust, pressure, counter-pressure, but never ever was the two giants use their power in the classic way of the great powers. They didn't go to war against each other. This was the longest peace, with enormous power being the other side of enormous power, being enormous caution. Never did, during the Cold War, did a Soviet soldier shoot at an American soldier or vice versa. And when they did, as it actually happened in the Korean War, where Soviet pilots were flying Korean airplanes, they didn't even speak Russian among each other, carefully trying to maintain the fiction that these were not Russian soldiers who were actually supporting the North Korean side. And those of you who've seen the Manchurian Candidate will get an idea how that ritual unfolded in that particular war. So, liberated, American power is liberated. Fundamental transformation. Why do I say that? Well, think about it. Do you think that the US would have attacked Saddam in the first Iraq war in 1991, who was, after all, at that point, a quasi-ally of the Soviet Union, equipped and trained by the Soviets, and so close to the underbelly of the Soviet Union? The answer, in my book at least, is no. It wouldn't have happened. That was not part of the rules during the bipolar era. Would the United States have gone to war against Afghanistan after 9/11? Probably not. That was, again, too close to the Soviet Union. And recall, for instance, how cautiously the US had acted during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, which began in '79, from '79 to 1988. There was no meddling, no open meddling on the part of the US. Yes, the CIA supplied the Mujahideen with stingers and training, but it was all done very underhandedly, and the rules of the game, don't openly confront the other giant, was always respected. But suddenly the US did go to war. It did attack Saddam. It did attack Afghanistan. And I would certainly, and of course, obviously, it did it again in 2003. I don't even think that Bush 43 would have gone back to Iraq in 2003 if Soviet power had still been intact. In fact, there's some nice interchanges between the Americans and the Soviets. And the Soviets certainly, the Russians. The Russians certainly didn't like it, but Washington simply ignored them because they no longer had the clout to do anything about it. So here was one critical consequence of the Gulliver Unbound syndrome. Now you might interject, if this were a real seminar and not, I was roped into a seminar, but I'm actually giving a lecture, which pains me to no end. If this were a seminar, somebody surely would interject, but wait a minute. You can't put all these three wars, Iraq I, Iraq II, and Afghanistan, into one basket. And I would actually agree, no, you can't, because that distinction is crucial to the rest of my argument. Because as we look at the world in 2006, the most vexing truth about US foreign policy is this: never has American hard power, its military might, its economic clout, been so high, and never has its legitimacy been so low. Now, to the distinctions among these three wars, I would argue, and I think persuasively so, that Iraq I and Afghanistan were legitimate wars, not only in the sense of legal under international law, which is a tricky body of law anyway, because nations tend to kind of pummel and knead it to make it fit their purposes, but it was legitimate in the sense that these two wars were prosecuted with the consent even cooperation of large part of the world. Iraq too, but on the other hand, as we know, was not legitimate. I'm not talking about legal, illegal. I don't want to get into that controversy. But it was not legitimate in this sense because essentially the United States plus the Brits fought that war alone. And without the blessing of the key powers ensconced in the Security Council, which had been the case both in Iraq I and Iraq II. The case for legitimacy in Iraq I and Afghanistan was very easy to make. After all, in 1990, Saddam had attacked and absorbed a neighboring country, which is a no-no under any international code. He had also disrupted the regional balance of power, and he was threatening the lifeline of the world economy, oil. So what was right or legitimate was also good realpolitik and vice versa, and this is why Bush 41 had an easy time assembling some 80 nations in his coalition against Saddam, and those who didn't fight put a lot of money into the American kitty. So essentially, the Iraq I was fought for nothing, for free, because the Japanese and the Germans paid billions into the American kitty. Legitimacy also enveloped Afghanistan, because here was a state, Afghanistan, that wasn't sponsoring terrorism, but that was sponsored by it. It was sponsored by terrorism. And Al-Qaeda had committed an unspeakable crime, again, under any moral or legal code. It had slaughtered the innocents, 3,000 of them. It had committed naked aggression. So Bush 43 had no trouble getting the UN's blessing and lots of allies to boot within about 24 hours. Not so in Iraq too. And remember what the arguments that were being used to legitimize that war. One argument was nuclear weapons, WMD. Well, apparently the UN inspectors in the past decade had done much better work than we thought, and that Saddam made us believe they had, because Saddam carefully played the card of having the stuff. He was very ambiguous and used his non-existing nuclear weapons as a deterrent, but in the end, he was not building any nukes. Was there a second reason? Was there a Baghdad connection in the international terror game? Well, it turned out no. Had he attacked anybody, as he did in the first Iraq, prior to the first Iraq war? No again. So, with legitimacy as consent being absent, the United States had to fight alone. And it got worse, because here was the world suddenly faced with this unchained number one, with this Gulliver untied, and the world did what the world always does when power is unbalanced. They start balancing against number one. They start ganging up to contain and constrain him, which exactly what happened. So you had that weird or bizarre spectacle of old allies of the United States, like France and Germany, linking hands with old enemies like Russia and China to stop the American juggernaut in his track. So I think that was the price of temptation that grew out of power unbound. And I don't think that it was, I don't believe so much in the neoconservative conspiracy, what have you. Some nations do things because they can. And suddenly America, for the first time in 40-odd years, operate in a world that posed no existential risk for the US. And so it did because it could. So the price we are paying at this point is, A, that the war didn't destroy terrorism, but actually gave it a new lease on life in Iraq as well as Afghanistan, and that it put a serious dent in US legitimacy, which legitimacy is a form of power. Because Because if power didn't come with legitimacy, then the schoolyard bully would always be elected class president. But we don't elect the schoolyard bully, because we elect the kid, who looks out for others, who pays attention to them, who doesn't only work for himself and takes into account the interests of other people, of other kids in the school. But you will be asking yourself, how do we get to the most foolish war? We are getting there. Because, and I'd argue the price is higher still. We're getting to that point now. Because part two of that imperial temptation that played out in Iraq was ideological. I argued, that power unbound breeds boundless exuberance. But not only could the US defeat each and all comers, being number one on the pinnacle and the penthouse of the international hierarchy, the US also went back to a very old tradition in American history. Suddenly there was a sense that, we can also remake the world. There's enough power not only to act in a classic strategic military sense, but to remake the world in the American image. And so Bush 43 went back to a very old tradition, you might say Woodrow Wilson, one better. You might recall that Woodrow Wilson wanted to repeat a famous phrase, safe for democracy, which was, make it safe for the democracies. Bush wanted to make the world safe through democracy. Very ambitious plan. That's not necessarily a bad idea. And as I said, it conforms with an ancient American tradition, which is much, much older than either Wilson or Bush 43. In fact, as early as 1791, Thomas Paine had asked in The Rights of Man, why aren't republics plunged into war? Republics was the then term for democracies. And his answer is, because the nature of their government does not admit of an interest distinct from that of the nation, and because the republican principles stand for peace and domestic prosperity. That is a classic American creed, that only good states make good foreign policy, i.e. stand for peace, and good states are republics or democracies. And this is not something that Bush 43 invented. Practically every American president, and you could end up with a long list of quotes, practically every American president, all the way to Clinton, believed that America's security rested on a secure world, but that secure world was not one that was governed by the balance of power or by military stability, but that secure world was a democratic world. And there is a very venerable theory. It's not just Americans like, or ex-Brits like Tom Paine and Jefferson and Madison and whoever believed in it. It was actually formulated by great philosophers like Immanuel Kant or by Tocqueville, who argued like that. And in fact, most recently, my colleague and friend Tom Friedman of the New York Times put another embellishment on it when he wrote a few years ago that no two nations have ever gone to war with one another who had McDonald's on their soil, which is a kind of version of the democratic peace, because McDonald's implies a certain level of prosperity, a kind of middle-class life, middle-class existence, and that's exactly what Kant, for instance, had argued when he said, well, if you ask the people to decide on war or not war, those who carry the brunt of war will actually vote no. So it's a Kantian corollary that Friedman worked on. I think he's been proven wrong by recent history. I now have at least two exceptions to the Friedman theory. One is NATO's war against Serbia in 1999, the air war. NATO has hundreds of McDonald's on its soil, and Belgrade, there are lots of McDonald's in Belgrade too. And the second counterexample was this summer, Lebanon and Israel. Both countries have McDonald's, though the Lebanese McDonald's also serve falafel. But that's just a kind of journalistic aside. But in general, though the democratic peace theory is pretty sound, I don't want to kind of ridicule the Bushies, especially, as I said, it's an old strain in American thinking. And it conforms mostly with the facts. It's actually true that democracies haven't fought each other yet. With the exception perhaps of my War of 1812, you might argue that Britain was a kind of parliamentary monarchy, and of course America was a democracy. But in general, it's true, no two democracies have ever fought each other. But there are at least two problems, which brings us even closer to Iraq now. First is, where do you execute this theory? Now, what do you pick as a playing field for this? And secondly, and more importantly, I think, in my book, is what about all these other interests that nations, great powers, must worry about, such about strategic interests, about military stability, about balancing power in the region and in the world. And I certainly think that that Iraq was the worst possible locale, and in more ways than one. And now I get to the my key contention, key claim. Iraq too, which was in the end, after we couldn't find the WMDs and the terror connection, so remember then was the end, in the end the justification that drove the war was a version of the democratic peace theory. Do it here, it was like a version of Frank Sinatra. If I can do it here, I can do it anywhere. Take the worst possible place. If I succeed, I can succeed anywhere. But I will argue that this was the wrong war against the wrong enemy at the wrong time, and this was no accident, comrades, as the Soviets used to put it. It was the logical outflow of a theory that sought safety not in containing and constraining hostile states, but in reforming them. Why do I say that? Well, if you had taken a realpolitik or a strategic conception of American security, you would not have focused on Iraq. You would have focused on Iran. Why? Well, Iran fit the bill to a T. Iran was building nuclear weapons and continues to build nuclear weapons. Iran has a long history of supporting terrorism, from Berlin in the 80s to Beirut in the 90s and this century, Hezbollah to Hamas. There's a real terror connection there. And finally, whereas Iraq was weak and under international supervision, in no way a strategic threat to anybody, Iran, with a very good and battle-hardened army, which had trained for 8 years in the war against Iraq in the 80s, Iran was reaching for hegemony over the Middle East and threatening all kinds of vital American interests. So that's the wrong enemy, as it were. But it gets worse, I think. By going to war against Iraq, the US did Iran's dirty work, which will not go down in history as a textbook example of brilliant diplomacy or grand strategy. If you made the movie, which say the opening scenes are the days that the United States marched into Baghdad when they pulled down Saddam, you might have seen a bunch of mullahs arguing among each other in a room. And one bunch would have said, oh my God, we are encircled, we've had it. We have American troops in the West in Iraq. We have American troops in the East, in Afghanistan. They're all over the place. They're in Saudi Arabia. We better shape up or knuckle under. But the smarter mullahs, in my script, would argue as follows. they would have said, thank you, great Satan, or thank you, Allah, or whispering at least. Thank you, first, for taking out our worst enemy in the West, the Saddam regime, the one country that kind of counterbalanced our power. Thank you, great Satan, for breaking Sunni supremacy in Iraq and liberating Shia power, our ideological kin, if you wish. We now have a Shiite belt reaching from Najaf to Qom, or from Tehran to Iraq. And 3, thank you, Allah, or great Satan, for bogging America down in the insurgency war to come, which we can manipulate at will. So the smart mullahs, not the quaking mullahs, the smart mullahs said, so let the United States threaten us over a nuclear weapons program. They won't have a military option anymore. Not with their loss of legitimacy in the wider world, not with their troops being tied down right next door. And my point here is this, it's a what-if question, but would Tehran or Pyongyang be thumbing their nose at the US right now on their nuclear weapons program if American power and legitimacy had not been so severely damaged by the war in Iraq? I don't think so. So back to the foolish war or the wrong war. My argument here is, had the US thought strategically or realistically or in realpolitik terms, the way great powers are supposed to think, rather than ideologically in terms of remaking the world, to make the world safe through democracy, I don't think it would have gotten entangled in the wrong war at the wrong time against the wrong foe. And thus, its strategic position in the Middle East today would be a lot better, and Iran's a lot worse. Because with American power intact, its legitimacy intact, it's a lot more credible to threaten Iran with military action, and therefore getting diplomacy unstuck again. If I were the Iranians, I would pocket every offer the Europeans make me. I would pocket it and still go on building my bomb program. What are they going to do to me? What is the United States going to do to me? What is the United States going to do to Kim Jong-il? He can read the newspapers. So that's why I think in that larger strategic sense, it was a very, very foolish war. And I would argue that by going after the wrong target at the wrong time, the United States destroyed whatever balance of power had previously existed in the greater Middle East. I don't think Iran would have even catalyzed that war against Israel by way of Lebanon, if it could have been more efficiently contained and intimidated. Now, my argument then is, great powers should not act so grievously against their own best interest. That's the upshot. That's what I would tell Mr. Bush, President Bush. But to go back to an earlier point, never before has American power, economic, strategic, cultural, been so strong, and never has its legitimacy been so weak. And there is now a vast gap between power and legitimacy, which must be closed pronto. So how would you do it? Well, I have 2 answers. I would say, 1, think strategically, not ideologically. Think more realpolitik and less idealpolitik. Set goals in line with means and sustainability. Use power wisely, and above all economically. And on the margin, like in Iraq War I. For that you have to cooperate with others or get the consent and get the consent of others. If you want to put it in movie terms, I would say to President Bush, think Spider-Man. Why? Well, there was Uncle Ben as he lay dying, and he whispers into Tobey Maguire's ear, with great power comes great responsibility. And so I would say, Mr. Gulliver, don't treat the Lilliputians with contempt. Don't make them balance against you, but bond with you. Don't make them gang up against you, but be with you. And conduct foreign policy in such a manner that as you pursue your own interests, you take along those of others, which actually, by the way, has been the mark of the most successful chapter of American diplomacy during the Cold War years, when the United States built this enormous alphabet soup of international institutions, the UN, the IMF, NATO, the World Bank, GATT, WTO, which all had one basic feature. They served American interests, but also served the interests of others. And that always translates into authority and leadership. So I think that now the recipe is repair alliances, rebuild institutions for your own sake. I mean, just think about something like, why should the United States be worried about free trade and enforce it? Well, free trade is good for everybody else, but it's very good for the United States as the number one or number two exporter in the world. And so if you kind of build these institutions, behave like Uncle Ben told the superhero, you don't have to worry about the Lilliputians ganging up against you anymore, because you're offering them collective international goods, public international goods, that from which they profit too. So I'm going to add to the metaphor salad by shifting from films to music. I would argue in front of the president, don't be a soloist like your Secretary of Defense, Rumsfeld, has tried to do now by his coalitions of the willing, by going it alone, by kind of brushing aside the offers of help of others. Don't be a soloist, go for the conductor's baton. Now, it's true that the conductor has to work very hard, very patiently, and he doesn't get to play first violin or any other instrument. But if he does his job right, if he manages to turn the quirks and ambitions of 80 players into a symphony orchestra, the reward is very high. It's called authority and leadership. If you take care of others, they will play your tune. And the interesting thing is, Bush 43 had it right in the campaign in 2000. It's a wonderful speech he gave where he said, if we are a humble nation, they will be with us. If we are an arrogant nation, they will dislike us. That's Bush 43 in 2000. And maybe his speechwriters in those days was inspired by a famous sermon by John Winthrop, the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, when he orated, this new experiment was to be a city upon a hill. You've probably heard that term before, 1630. But he said, only if we are an example to the other nations, if we live by the rules we preach. And I would add, that was not bad, though he was a Puritan and probably by today's standards, not very progressive thinking. But he was basically right. Because if you don't do that, if one doesn't do that, if you just let your, rely on muscle and power, then the city upon a hill, which is still the highest and mightiest in the world, will end up not as a towering but a very lonely place. And because history surely warns us that singular power, if it's unbound, is destined to breed temptation first and invite isolation and retribution second. And in between, it may breed silly or foolish wars, as the one that I've told you about. Thank you very much.
Okay, I will recognize questioners and commentators, and I'll do it as best I can in first come, first recognize Jason.
Is this a case in...
Make them identify themselves with their social security number.
My name is Jason Wire.
Jason.
Hello. Is this a case of the United States not appreciating its interests, like a snake that's been struck in the head and then just lashes out at everything? Or did we know what to do and then just screw it up? I mean, it seems so simple in retrospect.
Well, I mean, yes, I do claim 20/20 hindsight, of course. And I must say, I have to be honest, I thought for a while I believed that. I believed in the let's reform the world theory against my better instincts. A lot of people, even liberals these days, I mean, even Bush haters, say, well, actually, because it's really a very liberal reflex to say, let's not worry about realpolitik and power and bombs and bullets. Let's worry about democracy and goodness. They say, no, actually, that wasn't such a bad idea. They just screwed it up. That's what we've been saying for 70 years about socialism. It's a wonderful idea, but they've always been screwing it up. And if you keep screwing it up, you have to ask yourself, maybe the theory is wrong. And I would certainly argue that in my strictly kind of realist, realpolitik view that I present you with, it shouldn't have been done. You have to sometimes live with bastards in order to deal with the bastards that are more dangerous to you, as Iran is and as Iran has proved to be. Now, you might retort, yeah, but couldn't we have done it? Couldn't we have done it? And then I would retort, yeah, how? I asked that question, I posed that question in December 2002 to one of the ideologues of that war, one of the smartest guys I know. And I said, how long are you going to stay? And he said, we're not going to stay longer than 18 months. Oh? It took a bit more in Japan and Italy and in Germany. Yeah, we can't stay longer than 18 months, we'll be targets, which is very prescient, wasn't it? So I said, well, what are you going to do? Well, we're going to go in there, we hand over power to Chalabi. Do you remember Chalabi? Who had bamboozled my friend and others. He's a very smart, very charming man. I'm not being ironical here. We hand over power, we get out. I don't think that's enough for transforming an entire society which has known nothing but despotism since its very beginning. You have a better idea?
Well, I mean, it seems to me that there's a teleology that underlies these people's positions.
Correct.
They think they can just get the impediments out
We're
of
on
the
the
way
right side of
and
history.
democracy will flower.
Yeah.
And that's very much a view that's not grounded in any sort of empirical basis. It's sort of, they sort of pluck it out of their...
No, I disagree. That's a very important strand in Western political thinking, which goes back to the beginning of the Republic, the French Enlightenment, where exactly that teleology. Now, history is a history of stages. The stages are misery. History is destined to transcend itself, and now we're at the stage where despotism will die and freedom will flourish, which is Condorcet, Turgot, which is Kant, the Enlightenment, which is also very much the America. That's how America was born. I mean, this country was a vindication of the Enlightenment faith in the inevitability of historical progress. So it is a very important strain of Western thinking, but is there empirical data for a successful application? That's what you're asking, right?
Well, in the absence of a civil society for it to grow out of, I mean, it seems like you're correct that in Iran you would have a better chance of something like this flourishing where there is an actual civil society, but Iraq was so beaten down. I mean, how could...
Yeah. But you know what? There is something else which we should have known but ignored. There is apparently there's large parts of the world, which we used to call the third, that hates foreigners even more than it loves democracy and freedom. And that seems to be the pattern which we should recognize and respect it. Apparently, they'd rather be oppressed by their own creeps than to be liberated by Mr. Bush. And we saw that, and you add to that the strategic disadvantage of an external power which is fighting a war of choice at 10 and 12,000 miles away, in a war which is only remotely related to its own narrow self-interest. The locals will always know that the balance of interest is on our side, not on their side. This is our country. We can fight. It's not their country. So these are some of the reasons which should make one very, very, very cautious in getting involved in the transformation experiment. But do you know how it should be done? Should have been done?
I don't think it should have been done. I think that you're right that Iraq was the wrong war at the wrong time. There were a good number of folks who were saying that at the time. It doesn't even appear that the folks who got us into this have come around to the point of view that it was the wrong war at the wrong time. They'll still say it was the right thing. We just handled it poorly. We to change tactics, not strategy. And I'm not even sure they're being genuine about that.
Yes, I agree. I agree. I'm at least saying half mea culpa. So anyway.
Rust.
Totally.
Rust.
What?
Rust.
Rust.
Rust best.
Rust best.
There have been estimates for a long time now that the long-term cost of the Iraq War may be as high as $2 trillion. Assuming that that's roughly accurate, do you have any ideas about how we might have spent that money better?
It's a wonderful question, but it's a grandstanding question. You know, it's like saying there are so many people. Think about how many people are killed on the road each year. What about the few who are killed in A or B or C? Well, first of all, I find the 2 trillion number vastly exaggerated. And secondly, if it's right, it doesn't work that way. It's like saying for one wing of an F-15, we could build a whole new business school, or I don't know, at least fund the library. It doesn't work that way. They are not these trade-offs that we assume. If we don't build the F-15, we're not going to build the library either.
My name's Sergeant Travis Barstead, United States Marine Corps.
Oh.
What do you think George Bush should do, since he is a lame duck president, if Iran poses a greater threat? Now that we're already in Iraq, what should he do about that?
Well, are you asking me about the military option?
Just your basic opinion on that.
Well, my basic opinion is my conceptual, theoretical opinion is, no diplomacy works without the credible threat of force. And it's often the credible threat of force which allows you not to have to execute it. Or put it differently, power is when you don't have to threaten. Power is when others do what you want them to do without you having to actually beating their brains out. So since the Iranians know that the US doesn't really have a military option, and when I'm talking about military option, I'm not talking about, fly in at night and bomb a few sites and leave. I'm talking about a serious multi-week air war, which before you start attacking the sites, which I think can be attacked and can be destroyed. I have no problems with that tactical issue. But you would want to begin the war by, first of all, demolishing the leftovers of the Iranian Air Force and its navy, because you don't want them to be able to pose a threat against tanker shipping in the Gulf, right? That's the first thing that I would do. I don't want even one tanker to be sunk in the Strait of Hormuz. I don't want a barrel of oil to go up to $150 or $300, knowing how hysterical the oil market reacts. So then I would want to spend the next 2 weeks taking out every air defense I can in Iran And then I would spend the next week or so bombing and rebombing everything I know and everything I don't know. Because some of this stuff is, you want to be safe. You want to be safe rather than sorry, so you want to do a lot of redundant bombing. And that's a serious air war, which I don't think the Bush administration has the guts for right now. It has the means, and then we haven't looked at Iranian counter moves, which is terrorism, which is heating up the war in Iraq. The Iranians know all this, and that's why they're behaving exactly how they're behaving. So what should Bush do? I would, if you can't beat them, you at least want to deter them. And so I would make sure, I would go back to kind of coalition building, alliance building, containment, constraining them, almost like a Soviet, anti-Soviet policy, Mark II. Yeah.
Louis Kelly, thanks. Obviously, with everything that you said, it's made Iran and various Shia sects much more important, powerful in the region. At what point is there the prospect of and the dangers of the Sunnis and Shias saying that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and the people in the Muslim world getting together basically against us?
Well, haven't they done so? At least in Iraq?
But I mean, it still seems that the Sunnis and Shias are at their throats. They're fighting us, and they're.
Well, they actually, the interesting thing about the war in Iraq, as far as I haven't been there in 3 years now, because it's too dangerous. They're fighting each other. They're not fighting the U.S. That's the bulk of the fighting is not directed against the United States, and the United States is kind of staying out of the fighting. It's not pursuing a very aggressive strategy here, and so will they unite against the United States? I can only tell you that the hatreds of Shia and Sunni run very deep, and that the stake of the war between them has to do with kind of a rewriting of the power, the distribution of power in in Iraq. Sunnis have lorded it over Shiites for, I don't know, the last 500 years. And the war is being fought precisely because the Sunni, about 15% of the population, do not want to live under a Shia regime. So your theory has the kind of premise that the Sunnis will submit to the majority, or that the Shia will be very kind and gentle and promise to the former power holders under whom they had suffered so much a stake of power which will satisfy them. That's at least doesn't look very probable to me. I mean, anything can happen in that world, but that does not look very likely to happen. My theory.
Maybe Ron Karen, can you, back to Iran, can you foresee a scenario in which Israel acts as our surrogate and seeks to take out the Iranian nuclear capacity as they did?
Given what I just told you about what my scenario for the war is, I mean for the attack would be, it can't be done by the United States. What I just told you. I mean, the U.S. has the means. Let's make no mistake about this, and let the Iranians make no mistake about this. But the Israelis certainly don't have that. You have to look at the map. I wish we had a map here. How do you, if you're like, what do the Israelis have? They have extended range F-15, extended range F-16. That's pretty much it. They have a few tankers, 6 or 7, KC-135. Either you fly around the Arabian Peninsula, which is an enormous distance. I don't know, I once used the ruler and looked at, I was once planning this for myself, something like 5,000 kilometers or so. They have to land in between, or they have to be refueling, tens of times. Or they have to fly straight, which is they have to fly across Jordan, they have to fly across Iraq, they got to get. Or maybe they have to fly around through Turkey. If I were the Israelis, I wouldn't do it. Not with what I have, though they have a mighty Air Force, a very fine Air Force. The Air Force is larger than the French or the German one, but they don't have the kind of long-range power that you need for that job. That only the United States has. You know, yeah. Where? I can't see the speaker. Yeah. I thought it's a different
was
person.
able, with impunity, to attack Lebanon and destroy a good part of Lebanon, with no effective response or resistance from either the Mideast or the West.
Let me say that this is a very leading question. If you don't mind, I would rather not answer it. I mean, I know what answer you expect, and it's not the answer I'm going to give you. So,
I was thinking about the extent to which that can be seen as a move against Iran and Iranian interests.
No, it was, I mean, that war was a surrogate war, no doubt. The Israelis were fighting, the Iranians had acquired a border with Israel. If you want to look at it in strategic terms, not in ideological or terms of your preferences, which I can detect. But if you look at it coldly strategically, through Hezbollah, the Iranians have acquired a common border with Israel, and they used that surrogate force. The Israelis understood well that it's their first war against Iran, which is the mortal threat to their existence. So they fought it, and in the beginning with the support of most Western states, who all have an interest to weaken Hezbollah and to weaken Iran. And that's why Israel was given a free hand. There was no conspiracy here. But I think everybody was surprised by that war. The Hezbollah must have been really surprised as, gee, we've been doing this for 6 years, we've been killing 900 Israelis, we've been abducting them, and they never did anything. And now we take 2 guys and they go haywire? So everybody was a bit surprised by that war. But I think by acting the way it did, again in strictly strategic terms, Israel increased deterrence because it kind of displayed a reaction which was hard to calculate. And I think when I listened to Mr. Nasrallah, how surprised he was, I don't think he's going to do that again. And that's not bad. The Israelis have no reason to attack Lebanon. They got out of it 6 years ago.
If we had not invaded Iraq in 2003, was there a correct war to get into? If we did not.
No, but that's another leading question. But I'm glad that you asked it. I didn't argue that we should have gone to war against Iran. I said by not going to war against Iraq, the United States' power would have remained intact, its legitimacy would have been intact, and therefore its bargaining position towards Iran would have been a lot bigger than it is today. And again, diplomacy without the credible use of force usually doesn't get you very far. I learned that in a Dragnet series where you had the character who plays Al Capone says, you can get a lot farther with a gun and a smile. Gun in your hand and a smile than with a smile alone.
My name's Carl Williams. Situation in Iraq being what it is right now, regardless of how we got there, what are your recommendations from this day forward? I mean, we're there. You got to do something.
Let me try an easier one. I mean, look, I'm really flummoxed. I mean, I know what's going to happen. I can predict what's going to happen. This is going to be, U.S. force is going to retract toward Baghdad. It's probably going to concede much of the countryside. It is going to try to, how do you say it, Iraqize the war. We've done that before, I think, somewhere else. It's not going to work. it is already the Bushes in a very subtle way are kind of setting up an alibi. Say timetables must be met, benchmarks must be met. After the election, this bipartisan commission will come up with recommendations which pretty much repeat the same thing. And this thing will end up in withdrawal. You notice I didn't say that I like the idea or that I hate the idea, but I think that's what was going to, I mean, I'm totally helpless. I would not know what to do now. Yes, I mean, if we could 500,000 troops in there, then we are talking, but it's not going to happen.
My name is Avi Abramson. I just heard this on the radio driving down here, that Rumsfeld was saying that he is sending more troops today.
How much?
To Iraq. That's the part I didn't hear. I wonder if anybody else heard that.
You know, the U.S. troop levels have kind of fluctuated in the past too, 130, 140, 150, 130. But wouldn't you be very surprised if it were more than 10,000?
I was surprised to hear him. It wasn't a spokesman. It was he on the radio saying, "I'm sending more troops," and he said, "People will be surprised to hear this."
Yes, we are. I'd have to know how much. I know. You know, there's rotation going on.
My name's Jake Childers. Basically looking at the history of Iran during the 20th century, and I'm over here. See you looking up there.
No, I haven't smoked anything before I came in. I just can't locate, I don't have ear-eye coordination.
But looking at the history, of Iran, at least during the 20th century, they have made attempts of democracy, which after 1979, ultimately, has not gone their route. So obviously, there's a population of people there who are not as anti-Western and who are more pro-democracy than, say, the radical side of Iran. Do you think that a solution to the problem with Iran could be something that could be solved internally inside Iran itself? Or, this is kind of a two-part question. Do you think externally would just open another Pandora's box like Iraq? Because obviously having a population of people in Iran who attempted democracy before, of the 1920s, 1940s, 1950s, could that same population, the same group of people be able to make the change?
First of all, I agree with one of the premises, which is that the Iranian population is probably the most pro-American population in the neighborhood. I remember going to some rally there, and on the anniversary of the takeover of the embassy, by the embassy, they'd carted all these people from all over the place to this rally, and there was this mullah haranguing the crowd for 2 hours. And the list, his audience was always screaming, "Death, Mark Bar America," which means death to America. So death to America, death to America. Then he came down, and he saw me in the audience with my button down and Brooks Brothers suit and so my Ray-Ban. So he started talking to me. The first thing he did, is he kind of pulls out his Ray-Bans, puts it on, and says, as if to say, "Hey, I'm cool too." And the same people, who had been screaming death to Americans, says, "Oh, we don't hate you Americans, we don't hate you Americans." So this being true, you can't conclude very much from it. And the reason is that, remember that in the first 10 years after the revolution, after 79, Iran fought a two-front war. One was against Iraq. People say 1 million people were lost or so, but I have no way of checking the number. The same thing, they fought an internal war against various forces of the revolution, moved left, right, and so on. And they vanquished the Iraqi enemy and they vanquished the domestic enemies. So at this point, there's nobody, no formation, organization, institution of any weight that could give vent to the will of the people. There's nothing. It is, in that respect, is a totalitarian experiment that has worked very well. The field has been leveled. You can't just, the people may be pro-American and they may love to drink booze, what have you, but in order to make that will politically relevant, you have to organize them. And there's no organization there. So I don't believe that we'll have a transformation of the regime from the inside very soon. And certainly not as long as oil is above $60 a barrel. Do you know the first law of petropolitics? It's not mine, but it's Tom Friedman's. It says, the higher the price, the lower freedom. Because the more oil, the more money you can get for oil, the more money flows into the hands of the state, and the better it can buy off the people and avoid market-based economics and market-based economic development. So what you see is, all these states, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, oil is a curse. It's good for the regime and very bad for the people.
Steve.
You've got to be Norwegian to have both democracy and oil.
My name is Steve Super. And it would seem a possible extension of your realpolitik analysis that might assist with what next in Iraq, as well as how to deal with Iran, might involve identifying and supporting a strong secular Baptist Sunni general, which I gather there are a couple.
There are? Do you have their address? Don't tell anybody because you'll be dead tomorrow.
Well, basically to create a new style.
How do you do this?
What is the prospect of that? Is that anything that's even being thought of?
First off, if you know the guy's phone number and address, don't tell anybody because he's going to be dead tomorrow. Okay? And is there a guy like this?
I've read in The Economist that there are a couple of Sunni generals who are reasonably competent in the field with their military. So I don't know if that's anything to work with, but that's, perhaps all we have to grasp.
Well, I would think that in the end, Iraq will revert to some kind of dictatorship again. And in terms of my realpolitik model, I guess I'd have to live with it. Because I just gave you a long lecture why I didn't think the democratic imperative was such a hot stuff. I don't know how how it will work this time, because the society has now been rent in so many places. See, the Sunni general, which is essentially the Arab model of the 50s and 60s, right? There's a kind of state structure, and there's some ambitious young man like Nasser or Assad or Marshal Amer, who've preceded Saddam. What you have to do is you occupy the radio station. Today you have to do the TV station. You control the means of communication. You occupy downtown, and you take over the state. But there is no state to be taken over. So I think the Sunni general on a horse or on a tank is going to have a very hard time finding levers of power. So that would be my argument. Apart from which I don't know where the Economist got the names and numbers of these people. There's one on the flank here, on the far left flank.
I think he was first in
there. My name is Charles Cunningham.
You said earlier that attacking Iraq gave terrorists a new lease on life.
Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit more?
Well, just watch CNN. I mean, Iraq and Iran. What you mean, Iraq or Afghanistan?
No, I was just talking more about Iraq.
Well, Iraq. Look at what's happening there. Apparently, the international terrorism has taken Rumsfeld seriously. He said, we'd rather fight these guys in Iraq than in California. And so, yes, we'll do you the favor, Mr. Rumsfeld. And so all the terrorists who had nothing to do, who weren't occupied elsewhere, have gone to Iraq. a serious menace. It's become a battle. It's attracted all the enemies of the United States you can think of. They are there. So you may say, well, it's better they are there than in Marina del Rey or, God forbid, Missoula. But it's not a very, having to fight them all. Yeah, the idea was not to have to fight terrorists there, but to remove the reasons for terrorists. So it's the magnet theory of terrorism. Actually, Rumsfeld had his wish come true, but in ways that he probably didn't want them to come true.
My name's Bob McKelvey. We met once before.
Yes, you're a mathematician. Here?
You were here once, I think so.
That would involve, that depresses me, this idea, because that would involve a serious case of Alzheimer on my part.
Forget it. I'll tell you that.
Don't depress me anymore.
I'd like to have your...
But I was in Billings.
I'd like to have your insights about the reaction of the German polity to this episode of American adventurism in the Middle East and the way it has evolved. I know in the beginning, we all know that in the beginning, the German public, certainly the Schroeder administration, were quite hostile to what the United States has done. But things have changed, and I wonder how they've changed.
Have they changed? Have they changed? Well,
certainly, well, what has changed is we have observed what's happened in the Middle East.
Look,
all of these years.
What
Also a change of government in Germany.
I think that, well,
maybe they don't add up to any real change.
all of this is true. I think there was something about the Schroeder government that left office last fall. There was something visceral and personal about his contempt and dislike for W. Could happen, yeah. You don't have to be a German or a foreigner to have very strong emotions about the president. But I think that relationship was just beyond repair. And I think Bush disliked him, and I think maybe for good reason, because this is what I hear, at least from the White House, that when they met before the German electoral campaign of 2002, and the war was actually in its tracks, he had extracted a promise from Schroeder not to make this an issue in the electoral campaign. He says, all right, we want to press you to join us in the war, but then the deal is you don't make this an electoral issue, which Schroeder did, and which helped him to win the election, by the way, very narrowly. So there was a deep dislike between these two. So the first thing that the new chancellor did, is there a female form for chancellor? Chancellorette? Chancelloress? Chancellorine? What would you, Chancelloress? Chancellorette? The first thing she did was to move to repair the damaged American relationship on the sound premise that it is not in the interest of a medium power like Germany or any other medium power to have bad relations with the United States. Beyond that, and Bush lapped it up. He had a real good. The two of them had a real good time. I mean, not as a man or woman, but as heads of government. But beyond that, I think there are deeper forces at work here, which is that the Europeans in general have probably seen that, Iran, expansionist moves in Lebanon, the war in Lebanon, the Iranian nuclear program going unabated, no matter how many bribes the Europeans handed over. So the Iranian menace and the terror menace. In the meantime, Europe has experienced a number of terrorist attacks or foiled terrorist attacks, have brought the two sides closer together. And that is a kind of structuralist explanation for which adds to the personalist explanation that you have a change in government which removes the person that deeply hated the U.S., the president, in favor of one who...
That they weren't close to finish, or do you think it was poor strategy and will continue, and this sort of hurt President Trump?
I have another take on this. One of the obvious questions raised by the immediate post-war period was, hey, do you roll in there being totally unprepared? I mean, you didn't take care of security, the looting, electricity, what everyone has to do when you take over a country. There are things that a government or quasi-government has to do. That's public safety, etc., public services. So my friends in the State Department all assure me that the State Department had worked out wonderful plans for precisely that period, but that Rumsfeld kind of overruled them or outmaneuvered them on the theory that I gave you before. You know, we'll go in, we hand over power, and we leave. They had also, the Pentagon also made plans for the wrong contingencies. They had brought in 1 million blankets and cots and stuff. They thought the problem was going to be refugees. It wasn't. The problem was looting, electricity, etc. So, in short, the dissertations will be written about this, about the bureaucratic foreign policy bureaucracy. The State Department maintains they were outflanked and outmaneuvered, and of course the boys in defense say, no, that's not true, that's not true. We had a plan, but they screwed up our plan. But in this case, not that I'm instinctively pro-state, I think the State Department was righter than the Defense Department. Let me, in conclusion, give you a little anecdote, which I hope, or at least, if it doesn't make you any smarter, it will make you laugh. I happened to ask, about a year ago, I asked Henry Kissinger, look, were you better prepared when you got into Germany in 44, 45? He said, nah, it was the same kind of chaos and, you know, day by day. For instance, look at me, he said, I was in Louisiana in boot camp, cleaning latrines, and by sheer chance somebody found out that I could speak German and that I knew the country, and so I was shipped to the European theater, and because I knew German, they put me in the CIC, the Counterintelligence Corps, because we had a real problem there with Germans operating behind our lines in American uniforms. So we developed ever more complicated passwords. So what kind of passwords did you use? He said, well, baseball, of course. I said, did you know baseball? I mean, you're a recent immigrant. Oh, yes, I mean, I'd loved baseball. I'd studied everything in baseball. I knew the history of baseball. So I always knew the right answers, except they arrested me anyway because I gave them with the German accent.
Thank you, Dr.